Thank you, Mr. Johansson. I'm now going to recognize members for 5 minutes for questions, and I will begin the process. Mr. Johansson, what I'm hearing from you say in your testimony is that you can help, that your members can help in the California Farm Bureau. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's certainly in any sort of disaster or natural disaster, the first responders are often the landowners or neighbors. I mean, historically, there would be smoke on the horizon and everyone would respond. I think right now we're seeing devastating floods in the Tulare Lake now reemerging down in Tulare and Kings County. It is farmers, it is ranchers who are responding to shore up those levees. The same happens also in wildfire situations. But most importantly, too, as we grow upon the Good Neighbor Authority, is including those locals, those counties who understand those fire sheds. And perhaps it's burned before, maybe on a smaller scale, but understand how it responded 30 to 40 years ago. So certainly the front lines there can be your locals on the ground and your farmers and ranchers.
Thank you. Mr. Heithaker, in my opening remarks, I said we can respect our environmental laws and we can move quickly at the same time. From your time as a forest supervisor, would you agree that the Forest Service can utilize categorical exclusions to respect environmental laws and move quickly at the same time?
Yes, thank you for the question. The Forest Service has internally made concerted efforts to streamline our processes, and that includes a nationwide monitoring program. An effort started a while ago, environmental analysis and decision-making helped us look at ways to be more efficient internally. As you know, as we've testified on prior, 85% of our NEPA decisions are made through categorical exclusions. That's about 1,400 a year, and that's up from 70% around 10 years ago. All of those categorical exclusions comply with all statutory, regulatory, and policy requirements to implement that work on federal lands.
Do you believe that categorical exclusions undermine bedrock environmental laws?
They do not. They have to comply with all of those environmental laws. They are just another category of NEPA decisions. It's just excluded from analysis due to the fact that they've been determined with CEQ to not have a significant impact to the human environment.
With your first answer, this is something this committee and subcommittee is going to be watching very closely, is that we are getting the treatments done, because that is something that is very concerning with all the additional money that has been going out, that there are a significant number of treatments that are getting done. One more question, is the 10,000 acre categorical exclusion that is currently only available for the Tahoe Basin an example of where the Forest Service has been able to move quickly while respecting environmental laws?
Yes, I think if we look across our landscapes and how we operate, there's, the size of our decisions is often, in excess of 10,000 acres, 30,000, 40,000, where we find that there are no significant impacts. And having tools to help us do that work at scale faster is a benefit to us.
Mr. Desautels, you commented about how the drafting error in regards to the Good Neighbor Authority, I believe it was in the 2018 Farm Bill, it's my understanding you were forced to abandon a project on the Colville National Forest. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. The Congress expanded the authority for tribes and counties to enter into the agreements, but later in the act, in a section that would have allowed them to expend revenues generated from forest products, tribes and counties were not included in that section, and this bill would address that.
How many acres of fire-prone federal lands do you estimate you would have been able to treat if that would have been in place?
So that project area was roughly 30,000 acres, prior 40,000 acres, but the west quarter of that burned in the 2015 fire season for us. So that's something we're currently working on under a Tribal Forest Protection Act agreement, but we've seen significant fires all around that area since the 2015 fire season.
So if you could have done that treatment if the 2018 law would have allowed that treatment, how many acres would have that helped not succumb to fire?
So it's hard to predict how much we would have stopped it, because 2018 was a significant year, worse fire behavior than I'd seen at any point in my career, but almost certainly it would have reduced the fire effects. And I think it falls into one of those scenarios where we just aren't moving fast enough, that we're seeing projects burn during the planning process because the planning processes are lengthy.
Mr. Johansson, can we address this wildfire crisis without some reforms of NEPA?
Well, I mean, I think
Can you do it solely with funding? Or is it going to take some
no,
reforms?
it does take reforms. I mean, in California, we enjoyed a $100 billion surplus in our state budget. It's easy to throw money at a project, and we've thrown a lot of money at trying to address this in California. But as I've said before, just throwing money at a problem such as wildfire and forest thinning doesn't work unless you're actually doing the project and the project gets finished. It has to be expedited. We see, even locally, I mean, you heard if you're doing a mechanical thinning project, it could take up to 3 years to get approval in the forest, 4 years if it's a control burn, but theoretically, those are averages. We hear stories, and I get phone calls of frustrations from people in Murphy's, California, and Calaveras County, who are on their 7th and 8th year. So the expedited process has to go into effect in terms of how we rely on those forest plans that our foresters put together. And they're thorough and extensive and take a very long time. That should ultimately be what drives and moves forward projects, and not just.
Yeah, thank you very much. My time has expired, and I'd like to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Chief, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I've introduced the Forest Service Flexible Housing Partnership Act, along with my colleague, Senator Bennett, in the Senate, which extends an existing authority that I know is being utilized right now in my district in Colorado, in the White River National Forest. That particular project, as you may know, plans to develop 163 affordable housing units in a community adjacent to the country's most visited national forest. The project includes a set-aside for Forest Service employees. Now, in your testimony, you mentioned that the lack of affordable housing is a major barrier to recruiting and retaining your workforce, including the wildfire workforce. And I wonder if you might be able to provide some insight or perhaps expound a bit on how your agency works with project proponents to strike an appropriate balance between supporting both federal employees and the general housing needs.
Yes, thank you for the question. I am familiar with that project. I've worked closely with the Forest Supervisor, Scott Fitzwilliams, down there on the White River, and we do appreciate the authority given to us in that act. It's given us an opportunity that, while it has taken some time to figure out the nuances, as you can imagine, it's a complicated process, but the ability to partner in areas, especially in neighboring national forests, where Summit County, for instance, housing prices are exorbitant. There's not land available to develop homes. We have the land. We're able to work with these partners and through this leasing authority provide affordable housing to their employees and our employees. It's a great opportunity, and we're looking forward to working on expansion of it and continuing to build more in the housing world.
Well, I thank you for your remarks, and I couldn't agree more, and it underscores why the Forest Service Flexible Housing Partnership Act is so important in terms of ensuring that the Forest Service has these authorities into the future. Ultimately, the bill is about collaboration and cooperation, and that's something that we take great pride in Colorado, and I think this is an example, a way in which the Forest Service can apply that same model, perhaps in other communities across the country. I wonder if you, I suspect the agency has given some thought internally as to what other potential sites might exist to the extent that this legislation is enacted and the authority is extended.
Yes, absolutely. We have, as you know, affordable housing, firefighter pay, two of the biggest barriers to getting more firefighters on, retaining firefighters, investing in their health and well-being. And as I mentioned earlier, the number of communities that are in or adjacent to national forest systems that have housing costs that are just plain aren't affordable to people is a challenge that we're trying to overcome. And we have a couple other pilot opportunities that we're looking at and really looking forward to successfully implementing the project on the White River.
Well, again, I thank you for your testimony. I think this is a program worth supporting and extending, and so I'm hopeful that my colleagues will support it. And with that, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to the ranking member. I'd like to turn to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dugan, the provisions of H.R. 188 have been in place for nearly 8 years now in the Tahoe Basin Management Unit. And it's already been noted that when the Caldor fire hit a treated tract, as it barreled down on the city of South Lake Tahoe, it laid down and the firefighters were able to stop it. Meanwhile, in the adjacent El Dorado forest, U.S. foresters had been trying to treat the trestle project for more than a decade. They knew it was critical to protecting the town of Grizzly Flats, but the laws and the litigation arising from those laws had stalled the project, and it was still pending when the Caldor fire hit the tract, exploded, and utterly destroyed the entire town. Does the categorical exclusion under this authority, so I guess the first question is, why shouldn't we extend that to the 193 acres of the U.S. Forest Service? Can you think of any reason not to?
Well, I would submit to you as a targeted reference, there are significant, sufficient environmental safeguards, even under a categorical exclusion, where we've got compliance built in. So I see no reason why we wouldn't want to expand that categorical exclusion to all of these areas that we need to treat. We've shown it works. Environmentalists are happy.
Before we lose another town of Grizzly Flats, or a few years back, a town of Paradise. Have you observed a difference between the private forests in the Sierra and those under the care of the federal government?
Well, reality is yes, the private forests are able to respond. The private forests are also able to reforest quicker. So there's a lot of issues there, but when it comes to the topic for today's hearing, absolutely. And that's why we need the categorical exemptions, because we know the system works so slow in permitting.
Mr. Johansson, what have you observed regarding the condition between the private forests and the federal forests in the Sierra?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Mr. Dugan. It can be quite obvious, even traveling on Interstate 80 there in California, going to Nevada into the Tahoe Basin. You can definitely tell there is a difference in terms of active management of those forest grounds on private forest grounds.
You know, when they say, well, it's climate change, I think how clever of the climate to know exactly the boundary line between the private and federal lands and only devastate those on the federal side of the boundary line. Mr. Heithacker, I'm wondering about something. Half of California's forests are privately owned, the other half are administered by the Forest Service. And as has just been pointed out, you can tell the boundary lines between the private and federal lands just by the condition of the forests. Private lands are usually healthy, they're well managed, tree density is matched to the ability of the land to support it, and they actually make money doing that. The federal lands, the lands that you are responsible for, are densely overgrown, stressed, and dying, and you lose money doing that. You know, 5 years ago, I toured the footprint of the King Fire. The private lands, owned by Sierra Pacific Industries in this case, had been completely salvaged, and the funds generated from that salvage had been used to suppress brush growth, and you could see new, young, healthy trees that were already planted and growing. The federal lands, again, the lands that you are responsible for, had been abandoned. 6 feet of brush had grown up on those forest lands. No trees had been salvaged. And so all you could see was dry brush and dry, rotted trees falling on top of that dry brush, a perfect fire stack. In fact, the firefighters in the Caldor fire tell me, when the fire hit the King Fire footprint, it literally exploded because of the neglect of your agency. So private landowners make money keeping their forests in healthy condition, and you somehow manage to lose money keeping our forests in decrepit condition. Would you care to explain yourself?
I'll give it a shot. Thank you for that. I would say that we are working currently with the National Alliance of Forest Owners on a couple of agreements to help streamline some of that work across boundaries. We recognize the importance of that.
How do you explain the difference? You lose money keeping our forests in decrepit condition. Private landowners make money keeping their forests in healthy condition. I mean, why should anybody listen to your agency on matters of forest management, given that record?
I'd like to think that the agency has a very stout and educated group of scientists supporting our
Would you like to
decisions.
explain why the difference?
Well, our agency is guided by different rules and standards in those private lands. I think you're aware of that, which is National Forest Management Act, Multiple Use Sustained Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and
Well, those laws were
others.
supposed to improve the condition of the forest. We've lived with them for 50 years now. I think we're entitled to ask, how are the forests doing? And the answer is absolutely damning. And for your agency to stand in the way of any legislation designed to remediate that problem, I find appalling. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I turn to the committee chairman, Mr. Want to move on? We are going to go to a subcommittee chairman, Mr. Stauber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. St. Louis County, Minnesota is the largest county east of the Mississippi River, as well as my home county. St. Louis County is a checkerboard of federal and non-federal land. It is also one of the best examples of an area where all parties need to work together, be it the Bureau of Land Management or the U.S. Forest Service that manage our federal lands, or the local tribes and counties that manage our non-federal lands. Given this necessary collaboration that I have seen in northern Minnesota, I support enabling our leaders to work together and expanding Good Neighbor Authority. I am proud to support H.R. 1450, the Treating Tribes and Counties as Good Neighbors Act, which has been introduced by my good friend and colleague, Congressman Fulcher. Congressman Fulcher has been a leader in our conference on forest management, and I want to thank him for introducing this important piece of legislation that builds upon the success of Good Neighbor Authority. Mr. Heathecker, in 2018, Congress expanded the Good Neighbor Authority in the Farm Bill, expanding the program to counties and federally recognized Indian tribes. Can you speak to how participation in Good Neighbor Authority agreements increased following the changes made in the 2018 Farm Bill?
Yeah, thank you. I think as it's been pointed out here, it's important to note that I think as it was an oversight or an omission from that language to not have revenues retained by the tribes and the counties has been a barrier. With that said, we still have worked with numerous states, including the state of Arkansas, where I came from, to leverage that capacity to work across boundaries to implement restoration treatments that do include timber value as well as prescribed fire. Critical to collaborate with multiple agencies within each of those states, whether it's Fish and Wildlife to protect critical habitat, to work with them on administering the timber sales, allow them to generate the revenue to help them do that work and build capacity to support that work. So absolutely think that we will benefit if we can get the retention of revenues for tribes and counties and allow us to expand that opportunity as was already shared today. And as you know, the opportunities exist, and where we can make those more effective and more accessible, it's going to benefit all of us.
I appreciate your comments. Mr. DeSautel, you represent over 60 tribes that make up the Intertribal Timber Council, and in your testimony, you noted the benefits that you have seen under the Good Neighbor Authority program. Would you say that the tribes that you represent have missed out on the potential added benefits of Good Neighbor Authority since the 2018 Farm Bill only allows states to utilize funds from timber sales?
Yes, sir. I think if the authority had been expanded or the language had been corrected early, that tribes would have utilized that authority early to take advantage of the funding that's available in the infrastructure bill to help support good neighbor agreements. Because for the states that I'm familiar with, Washington State, where I live being one of them, the state had to put in essentially seed money to stand up the program, to establish staffing, and develop the project planning and NEPA analysis on the first projects to generate enough revenue to support that work going forward. So with this funding, it would have given tribes the opportunity to generate that revenue, stand up that program, build that capacity, to utilize that authority for an extended period of time to do that treatment that's needed on adjacent federal land.
With the hopeful passage of this legislation, they'll be able to just do exactly what you stated, invest more, and the money comes directly to them. It is clear that since its introduction over 2 decades ago, the Good Neighbor Authority program has facilitated co-stewardship of our federal and non-federal lands and has brought federal land managers, states, counties, and our tribes together. Over these past 2 decades, Congress has taken great steps to improve and expand Good Neighbor Authority. And I commend the provisions in the 2018 Farm Bill. However, we have a great opportunity right now to continue this success story and make changes that fully take advantage of the Good Neighbor Authority in Mr. Fulcher's legislation. I strongly support allowing counties and tribes to utilize proceeds from timber sales to take additional steps to work together and protect our federal and non-federal lands. And I look forward to supporting Mr. Fulcher's bill that will make this fix. It's important to recognize that the 3 entities, states, counties, and tribes, can take advantage of this, and allow healthy forests and conservation, along with financial security with those funds returns back to those same entities. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stauber. Next, I'd like to turn to the gentlewoman from New Mexico for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Chairman Tiffany, Ranking Member Neguse, and for the members on this conversation. As you know, I always look forward to it when we have the bipartisan support for including tribes, recognizing them as sovereign nations, and that we must include them in our various legislation to ensure that they are able to take care of and participate as sovereign nations in our many programs that we have on the federal level. Thank you so very much for your testimony. I'm also really pleased to have in today's hearing the inclusion of ranking members Forest Service Flexible Housing Partnership Act, because affordable housing is important everywhere I go in my district. As we know, the issue of affordable housing is important across this country. Workforce housing is very, very important. I focused on that both before I got to Congress and then when I'm able to through our community projects, through our congressionally supported projects. And in places that are really gorgeous and beautiful, it's sometimes even harder, right? Because the market prices, regular folks just out of the market. And so in places like Santa Fe and Taos, we really see that as very important. Mr. Heithacker, can you discuss a little bit more about the ability to lease administrative sites that would benefit the Forest Service and what that looks like on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. It is it's a unique authority for us. I mean, just think about it. If you're a private landowner and you want to lease part of your property, let somebody else build a house and have other people live there. I mean, it's just the complexities of working that out. It's an interesting arrangement. So the authorities given within that act are really they're new. We're trying to figure those out, and we're learning as we go. But that exact situation is what we're working on in Dillon, Colorado, which is we have a chunk of administrative land that's being underutilized. We have both the city, the county, state, and the Forest Service who have employees that can't afford housing there. So through that authority, we're allowed to lease the land to the city in this case and have them build housing to basically offset the cost of that lease. They allow us to have our employees stay there. So it's a really beneficial, mutually agreeable arrangement that provides affordable housing to both the city of Dillon and the Forest Service. And also in Colorado, we're working with another group to look at another model to work directly with the state on how we can accomplish that in other communities throughout that area and others in the country.
Right, and I look forward to you looking at sites in New Mexico because
Absolutely.
I think the ability to utilize lands that are available to their best purpose is part of that. Touch a little bit about, you said how the complexities of doing it. What does it do in terms of being able to recruit and retain employees to know that they will have housing close by? Because if they don't have it there, what would a commute look like?
Well, it's really one of the biggest challenges we have, as I mentioned, in addition to firefighter pay. But if you're a firefighter coming in, you're working these really long and grueling shifts, really risking your life in many cases. And folks can't afford to, folks live in their cars. I mean, that's what they're up against in some of these communities. I mean, the community of Dillon in itself, Summit County in general, is one of the more expensive areas that we have employees. And the fact that we can create at least some solution to allow folks across these other sectors to live there and be able to afford to live there. I mean, it's a night and day experience for them, a game changer from my perspective.
And I think that touching upon that, we are asking somebody to risk their lives to help protect our forests, because they are often, there's lots of important reasons to suppress, to address wildfires, but they're sleeping in their cars. Yeah. Right, and this is the same thing in terms of when we're looking at pay, right, and making sure that we have presumptions with regard to the illnesses that they cover. So I think that recognizing there is a wide range of needs that those who are at greatest risk need, that ranging from housing to pay to the presumptions with regards to illness is very important. So thank you for answering those questions, and thank you for introducing the bill. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. Next, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. I'm start with Mr., or I guess it's Deputy Chief Heidecker. The HR 934 proposes to require the Secretary of Agriculture to carry out the activities to suppress wildfires. In meeting with various timber companies back in Oregon, they asked me if I would just do one thing when I got here, and that is to convince the Forest Service to put out the fire the moment they see it, as opposed to allowing it to burn. This legislation would do exactly that. Would you suggest that this legislation is not necessary right now?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As we stated in our testimony, the concerns that we would have is that we would lose tools that are critical for us fighting fires. And if you look at our data, it's 96 or 98% of all of our fires are caught within the first 24 hours. So you have a very small percentage that are not, and I think it's 1% that we currently either monitor or manage for resource benefit.
Let me just suggest that when I was out on the side of the various mountains, we drove around spending a couple of days looking at where the fires had not been put out as soon as they could have been. I will share with you that the damage was horrific, and it wasn't just the forest public land that was damaged. So I think the bill is absolutely necessary. Let's go to another question. I note that there in your budget for this year, 2023, there's $321 million allocated to management of hazardous fuels, and I'm very happy for the effort to clean up, if you will, the forests that under your 10-year plan you're working on. But I just want to know who's doing the work. Who's out there actually reducing fuel loads in the forest?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's going to be a mix. I mean, we're approaching this as all lands, all hands approach, and as you know, we work with the states, as I mentioned before, Good Neighbor Authority. We hopefully work with counties and tribes.
Let's stop there.
Okay.
When I've gone out and looked and see who's doing the work, I see contract laborers doing the work. Most speak Spanish, and it looked to me like they were doing great work, working pretty hard, but they were working under a labor contractor generally, or someone else of like nature. And I'm happy they're out there doing the work. I just want to know, is that your observation? Is that who's actually out there doing the work?
I think there are, in cases that's an observation. Yes, it's not an observation I've made. Again, I came from Arkansas, worked on the Ouachita National Forest. That was primarily Forest Service employees out there, both full-time firefighters as well as what we call the militia, reserve firefighters, working hand in hand with the state and counties to do that work.
Well, that would not be the case on the West Coast. It's just, and we have 90 million acres of forest. Now, it's not all federal, but the work that's getting done in significant part is being done by folks that are not what I'll call found anxious to do that kind of work. There's the problem. I've fought fire before very badly, very poorly, and I realized really quickly it was hard, dangerous, dirty work. I've also gone out and cleaned up forests, believe it or not, when I was in high school, and it is hard, boring, hot, and most people don't want to do it. That's why I became a lawyer, so I wouldn't have to do it. And I'm just saying that it appears to me that the actual work that's being done to clean up the forest right now is primarily being done by immigrants. And I just wanted you to comment on that one more time, but if you don't know, that's fine for you to say.
Yeah, I don't have that in front of me, and I could talk to you about our wildland fire hiring numbers and those sorts of things. But I would just offer that it is a mix of contracts, it's partners through agreements, and our own employees.
The last thing I'll mention, and sorry to have focused on you this entire time, but there's a huge part of Oregon is controlled by the Forest Service. There was a prescribed burn done not too far from where one of my brothers has a ranch and has a grazing permit. And it was badly managed, and there was an absolutely clear lack of respect by the Forest Service for the private land owners. Can you comment on that? Is there someone overseeing these folks' activities? Because there seemed to be an arrogance level and lack of respect that does not bode well for prescribed fires.
I'm surprised to hear that, and certainly there is a level of oversight. we have, district ranger as a local line officer, you have your burn bosses that qualified through our rigorous process, as well as forest supervisor and on up from there. So if that's the case, we've as escapes in New Mexico drove us to pause our prescribed fire activities, do a comprehensive review of that program, and have made changes as a result of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bentz. Next, I'd like to recognize Mr. Moylan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Heathaker, it's good to see you again. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the informational trip we had to the Yale School of Forestry and the Yale Forest as much as I did. Of course, it was very interesting to hear about the Yale forest managers and the response to this complex challenge they have in their forest. And for yourself, Troy, as someone who has spent time in a lot of different national forests across the country, can you just expand and talk about how important it is to empower individual forest services units to meet the unique needs facing their forest?
Yeah, the examples, thank you for the question. It's good to see you again, too. It was a great trip. I enjoyed just the time together to talk forest policy and think about where we're heading with how we manage these great public lands that we're entrusted to steward. The trying to answer any question in the Forest Service, with one answer is really challenging. I mean, we have forests from Florida all the way up to, central Alaska. And so having the ability to shape management and activities based on those specific ecosystems, what the local public and the communities need in terms of resource management and benefits it's I wouldn't say it's a challenge, it's an opportunity for us. And so we have to be flexible. We have to understand what those each of those ecosystems, each of those forest types needs. And like I said, working across boundaries with the partners and being as collaborative we can is really critical for us to get that work done.
Thank you for that. Next question is for Mr. Johansson. I believe the best solutions come from the ground up and are locally led. The FIRESHEDS Act allows states and local entities to address firesheds on both federal and non-federal land. How would this state and local knowledge help the Forest Service in treating more wildfire-prone areas?
I mean, I think it just comes from local knowledge in the history of the forest. And as I said before, as far down, it's true in politics even, right? The most responsive is always how far down you can get to local, whether that's politics or whether that's managing a forest or a fire shed. There's going to be more you bring in the counties and you bring in the tribes who live there and it's their home. You're going to have a much more responsive push to address the situation that the forests need in terms of managing them. So I think ultimately, too, you have another partner. You have another partner at the local level, to assist, because we know that the Forest Service, in terms of acreage that they have to manage, is overwhelmed. We can see that in terms of even after a fire, we can only reseed up to 8,000 acres, a year. So I think it's imperative that you start looking locally and look down for more assistance for the Forest Service, and then even at the state level.
Thank you for your response, panel. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You bet my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moylan. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Westerman, the chairman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It seems like I've been out in the field with all of you at some point, and I appreciate your commitment to forest stewardship and the good things that come from that. Troy, thank you and Deputy or Undersecretary Wilkes for joining us on the field hearing last week, or field trip last week, and we saw how difficult the managing that forest in Connecticut can be with the various species and the management objectives, but they don't have to do NEPA, they don't have any regulatory requirements they have to go through, they're not concerned about litigation. Throw all that on top of what your folks at the Forest Service experience, and it makes your job very difficult. And that's why as policymakers we get frustrated, because what we're looking at are results. We want to see results on the ground. We want to see acres treated. We want to see CEs used, like Mr. McClintock has got passed, that show great results on the ground. We want to expand those policies. I just have to ask, did CEQ review your testimony before you were able to submit it?
Our testimony goes through a review process, yes.
Yeah, that's enough said about that. So I've been around you in the field. I know you know how to manage forests. You did a great job on the Ouachita National Forest. And I know that you're a forester and you understand what needs to happen on the ground, but you're also working in this framework and this environment that we've created here in Congress, and that's why we want to change that. Can you speak a little bit about how, when you can do your job, how successful it can be? I know the Ouachita has been one of the most productive forests in the country. It still needs a lot of work done on it, but even talk about the shortleaf pine blue stem grass restoration project and how that's benefited the red cockaded woodpecker, plus generated timber revenues to do more work on the forest.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. And thank you for the trip. It was a great opportunity, as I previously mentioned, for us to talk about those shared interests and how we can help better steward these lands. And in my opening remarks, I did refer to the Ouachita as being the most productive and actively managed one of them in the forest in the country. And I was surprised Chairman Tiffany didn't come back at me with Schwamigan, Nicolay, or one of those others. It's always a back and forth. But I think the work in the pine blue stem is just a shining example. If you look at how we accomplish the work through CFLRP, collaborative process, looking across land ownerships and working with partners, literally hand in hand on a prescribed fire, and also being able to deliver commercial timber products to restore critical habitat for a threatened and endangered species. As a result of that work and the ability to do that work at pace and at scale, it led, I believe, in no small part to the downlisting of the red cockaded woodpecker. And just, again, balancing the needs of those ecosystems, the frequency of the treatments that's needed out there while delivering commercially viable products. I'm going
to have to cut you off there. It's a great example of how you can have a healthy environment and a strong economy at the same time. The two go hand in hand. It's a great example of how the intent of the Endangered Species Act was followed, which you read the Endangered Species Act and it talks about conservation and conservation and conservation. And that's how the Forest Service and other agencies get their hands tied by Fish and Wildlife when they start listing species and saying leave their habitat alone. But we need to do more projects like that. Cody, I got a chance to spend some time on the Colville Forest last summer, and I know great work that tribes are doing all across the country, and I'm a huge supporter of more Good Neighbor Authority. We were talking about New Mexico earlier. I was down on the Lincoln National Forest. The Muscalera Apache tribe has some of the most beautiful ponderosa pine stands that you'll see anywhere, and just down the road in Lincoln National Forest, it's a moonscape where tens of thousands of acres burned and have not even, they don't even regenerate. It's so bad. But talk about how important it is to grow Good Neighbor Authority to get tribes more involved and what we can do to help make that happen.
All right, so the legislation proposed today, I think, will accomplish that. But I mean, tribes are a great proving ground. We have the ecologic knowledge, traditional ecologic knowledge of what the landscape should look like and how we accomplish that. And I think because we fall under different regulatory frameworks, we can be examples and testing grounds for land management policies. And I think most folks that work with tribes recognize the great work that happens in an Indian country, and we can use that blueprint on our adjacent federal lands and partner with them to make sure we accomplish those same management goals.
Well, I look forward to working with you and all the tribes that are doing great work to hopefully greatly expand that Good Neighbor Authority. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your questions. And I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony today. It is greatly appreciated. And we're going to move on to our third panel now. And while the clerk resets our witness table, I will remind the witnesses that are coming for our third panel that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. I'd also like to remind our witnesses of the timing lights, which will turn red at the end of your 5-minute statement, and to please remember to turn on your microphone. As with the first panel, I will allow all witnesses to testify before member questioning. Our witnesses for the third panel are Ms. Reva Duncan, Mr. Rick Goddard, Mr. Lawrence Crabtree, and Mr. Jonathan Godis. Did I say that correctly? Hope so. Okay, we're going to start with Ms. Reva Duncan, who is the Vice President of Grassroots Wildland Firefighters. We look forward to your testimony in the next 5 minutes.